I had the privilege of seeing Robert Edgar's Nosferatu last week. The dark subject matter and moody color palette just seemed completely appropriate to ring in the new year. It is rare that an adaptation of a classic tale really blows me away, but this one did. Its fresh take on the Count Orlok character, combined with some of the most beautiful cinematography I've seen all year, made this an unforgettable movie-going experience. Not to mention the sheer talent of all the cast. I myself love Lily Rose Depp, and was blown away by her portrayal of Ellen Hutter, the central character of the film who is the vessel for Count Orlok's darkness and the object of his desire. Did anyone else watch the short-lived drama series The Idol? It was so bad, but I binge-watched it because I found Lily Rose Depp so compelling in her role as Jocelyn, the troubled starlet. She carried that show. For being a Nepo baby, the girl can act, and she really shows that off in this film. I have a particular affliction for vampire movies. I once went to a 24-hour vampire movie marathon. Granted, I only lasted 13 hours, but I packed in a lot of movies during those 13 hours. Vampire movies are inherently sensual, with the act of biting standing in for sexual intercourse. What really intrigues me about Nosferatu, unlike some other monster movies, is that woman and monster converge. Nosferatu alone does not prey on Ellen. She lusts for him. She calls to him. Nosferatu is the physical embodiment of the darkness that Ellen feels inside of her, and as a result, there is a kinship between the two characters that is tragic, yet kind of romantic. We will be discussing elements of other works of art as it relates to female sexuality, and that perhaps what vampires really represent are men's fears of said sexuality, as vampires and women are more closely linked than you may have thought. Welcome back to Silver Screen Queens, a deep dive into the portrayal of women on screen. There are spoilers in today's episode, but as with any episode, I don't want that to dissuade you from watching any movie I discuss. Warning, there is vulgar language and adult topics that I will be discussing. Listener and viewer discretion is advised. So now, let's discuss Nosferatu. Cut. Before we jump into the character of Ellen Hutter, let's discuss the history of the story of Nosferatu. The 1922 silent film Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, was an unauthorized adaptation of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Dracula. Director F.W. Murnau, of course, changed Count Dracula to Count Orlok, or Nosferatu, as well as the other characters' names. The 1922 film was a marvel of German expressionism, highlighting the turmoil and fear after World War I. Watching the two films back-to-back is an interesting viewing experience. Silent films lend themselves to over-the-top acting, grandiose gestures, and heightened facial expressions, with the music conveying the mood of the scene, a film technique still used today. It is not necessarily scary by today's standards, but paved the way for vampire movies to come, and forever changed the method in which you kill a vampire. In Dracula, Dracula is killed by stabbing him in the heart, but in Nosferatu, he is killed by sunlight. Florence Stoker, Bram Stoker's wife, sued the film's production company and won, with the German court ruling that all copies of Nosferatu be destroyed. They, of course, were unsuccessful in killing Nosferatu, with many adaptations of the story being made throughout the 20th and 21st century. None of these adaptations have had a cultural impact like the 2024 version is shaping up to have. Perhaps this is due to its star-studded cast. I mean, who doesn't love Willem Dafoe? But on a deeper level, I believe it's because we empathize with the Ellen character and can feel her sadness and pain through the screen. Set in 1838 in the fictional German town of Visburg, Thomas Hutter embarks to Transylvania in order to sell Count Orlok an estate, leaving his wife Ellen behind in the care of his friends Friedrich and Anna Harding. Ellen begs Thomas not to leave after having a vision of death, and is subsequently plagued by night terrors after Thomas's departure. When Count Orlok brings the plague of death to Visburg, Ellen has to make the ultimate sacrifice in order to save the man she loves and end the suffering of the city. I appreciate how much the 2024 film draws back to its predecessor. It doesn't stray too much from the original plot, while still making it its own beautiful work of art. But what is so successful in the new version of the film is that you can feel Ellen's pain more than you can in the 1922 version, which is not a fault of its own. It's hard for us to empathize with characters in silent films, largely because the acting style just seems outdated. In both versions of the film, Thomas gifts Ellen flowers after finding out that he's been tasked with finding an estate for Count Orlok, one that will make him a favorable amount of money. This deed of giving your lover flowers is supposed to be seen as romantic, but it deeply upsets Ellen, who remarks on how Thomas has killed the beautiful flowers. This is because she knows what these flowers mean, that Thomas must leave and therefore become victim to Count Orlok, just as her visions predicted. The 2024 film does something really smart and brings these flowers full circle when at the end of the movie, Dr. Eberhardt places these flowers on Ellen's body like a funerary ritual. Women, especially virgins, have long been associated with flowers. As the BBC states, quote, "When things start getting real sexy is the 18th century. When the botanist Carl Linnaeus classified the world's organisms according, in part, to their means of reproduction. Linnaeus's Species Plantarum of 1753 did not just pin down all the known world vegetation with Latin names. It established that plants reproduce sexually and offered a scientific rational basis for the analogy of humans, usually women, to flowers." End quote. When we think of flower art that represents female anatomy, what do you think of first? I think of Georgia O'Keeffe, who actually denied this attribution about her paintings. But her close-up renditions of irises and orchids bring with them a certain visual language that lends itself to a vulva. Regardless of O'Keeffe's intentions, her paintings made male critics in the 1920s extremely uncomfortable because they saw them as vulgar depictions of sex and female sexuality. But let's take it back even further. I stumbled upon this painting called Venus and the Lute Player from the 16th century. In this painting, Venus lays nude on a chaste lounge as Cupid places a wreath of flowers on her head. As the Met website puts it, quote, "In this painting, Venus is more than an object of desire. In her devastatingly confident pose, she becomes a symbol of the power of woman over men." End quote. This power, of course, is her sexuality. When Dr. Eberhardt places the flowers on Ellen's body at the end of the film, it is symbolic of her finally claiming her sexuality. Like this painting of Venus and the Lute Player, Nosferatu is a work of art that symbolizes female sexuality, a power that with it comes fear from those around Ellen and even from herself. This is the crux of what I want to talk about in relation to Nosferatu, that the darkness or shame that Ellen feels is in relation to her sexuality, and that Nosferatu is the physical embodiment of her shame, when they are really one and the same. Little rhyme for you. At the beginning of the film, Ellen calls on to Nosferatu.
"Come to me. Come to me. A guardian angel. A spirit of comfort."
She herself seeks out this darkness as solace for her shame, as someone to confide in. It is no surprise that there is sexual tension between Ellen and Nosferatu. And I mean, they gave him an exquisite mustache, like, hello. Back in the 19th century, when this story takes place, sex, specifically female sexuality, was extremely taboo. In an 1887 sexual health manuscript, Henry Hanchett describes women as having non-existent sex drives, and that only women who were, quote, deranged would succumb to the temptations of masturbation. This, of course, is not true, and it's just a prime example of men knowing nothing about female sexuality. Nosferatu satiates Ellen's desires, but she feels immense shame about her visions of him. At one point she says, quote, "He is my shame, he is my melancholy." These visions stop after she meets her husband, Thomas. Once a woman is married, it is seen as societally acceptable to consummate the marriage. In her marriage, she is finally expressing her sexuality and is rid of her shame. But the visions return once Thomas embarks to Transylvania. Maybe because Ellen has time to ruminate on the fact that perhaps her husband isn't satisfying her. In discussing Nosferatu 1922, Linda Williams states in her essay, When the Woman Looks, quote, "It may well be then that the power and potency of the monster body in many classic horror films should not be interpreted as an eruption of the normally repressed animal sexuality of the civilized male, the monster as double for the male viewer and character in the film, but as the feared power and potency of a different kind of sexuality, the monster as double for the woman." End quote. If women and vampires are one, as I believe Ellen and Nosferatu are, then what the men in the movie are really fearful of is not this monster, but a woman, specifically woman's sexuality. There are many parallels between Ellen and Nosferatu that insinuate that they are one and the same. When Count Orlok attacks Thomas one night, clutching his throat and lifting him in the air, the vision of Ellen quickly flickers before him, as if she is the one attacking him. And when her visions return, the doctors reveal that her condition is caused by too much blood, which leads one to assume that the blood that Nosferatu is sucking is in Ellen's body. Before the two become entangled, Ellen says to Thomas, quote, "You could never please me as he could." She is not satiated by Thomas the way she is by Nosferatu. This, of course, drives Thomas mad. His anger seems to derive from shame that he can't satisfy his wife, and therefore the act of having sex with Ellen becomes a competition of sorts with Nosferatu. The sex is short-lived, with Ellen breaking down in tears and telling Thomas to keep away from her because she is unclean, which relates back to her shame about her sexual desires, ones that Thomas isn't meeting. Who Thomas is really trying to prove his worth to is Ellen, because Nosferatu is always a part of her. She is the host in which he resides. As Lloyd Wright puts it, quote, "The vampire figure is constitutionally female. Assuming the femininity of vampires as a possibility, a further observation can be offered, that vampires are impotent, not merely because of incestual guilt, but primarily because, as females, they are not capable of male sexual performance," end quote. Well, Freud, and I hate to bring him up, argues that lack of semen means a sex act can't be pleasurable. Ellen begs to differ. While I don't think all vampires are women or that lack of semen negates manhood, I think Thomas is threatened by Nosferatu because he brings with him a sensuality that is more akin to a woman. And just like how men at this time were afraid of female sexuality, they were afraid of the vampires that represent that sexuality. On the menu tonight, we have the Corpse Reviver, obviously. This is a prohibition drink, well, a variation, because I wasn't going to rinse the glass in absinthe. Absinthe? No. So we're gonna do gin and then orange liqueur and some grenadine, cause blood, you know? 1 shot of dry gin. I believe it's just 111. Orange liqueur. Oh, it's just like crusty and old. Well, I don't love orange, but that's fine. Just a smidgen of grenadine. Or a lot. Whatever. Oh, I need lemon juice. I feel like lemon juice makes everything taste better. We're gonna put like a pretty decent amount. Because I don't know about the orange liqueur. I'm scared of it, so I'm not gonna. Into our chalice. ASMR. All right, here is a sort of rendition of the Corpse Reviver. Let's give it a taste. Oh, yeah, it's good. It's strong, but it's good. Cheers. During this time, like the 19th century sexual health manuscript outlines, men wanted to believe that women lack sex drives until it comes to making a baby. The character Friedrich is a great example of this. He constantly lusts after his wife Anna, with her not entirely reciprocating this lustfulness. Anna is the opposite of Ellen when it comes to sexuality. She acts in a manner deemed appropriate for women to act. She gives into Friedrich's passes, with it bearing children, without ever leaving the bounds of acceptability. She is constantly talking about God and saying that Ellen's visions are just due to the fact that her husband is gone. Perhaps this is part of the reason why Friedrich doesn't like Ellen. She doesn't act in accordance to how he thinks a woman should act. In one scene in the film, Friedrich and Anna bring Ellen to the ocean. Friedrich gets upset at Ellen and walks away with Anna, remarking on how he can't keep his hands off her and asking how their baby is doing, as she is pregnant with their 3rd child. While they are having a sidebar, Ellen thrashes uncontrollably in the ocean. Of course, there is a long-standing history of women and the ocean, specifically hysterical women being sent to the ocean to be cured. But more importantly, the sea is often seen as a feminine force, one that symbolizes birth and fertility. I believe this scene is meant to further divide how men perceive Anna and Ellen. Ellen literally thrashing around in a symbol of fertility demonstrates her inability to align with society's ideals, aka having sex only to conceive, as Anna does. Ellen has a very different relationship between the men and women in her life. Ellen and Anna Harding have a very tender friendship in the movie. Ellen confides in Anna for things she can't tell the men around her for fear of being crazy, such as, quote, Do you ever feel as if you're not a person? And she sleeps in Anna's bed after Thomas kicks her out after returning to Visburg and having a night terror. On the other hand, Ellen is constantly restrained by the men around her. When she has these visions of Nosferatu after Thomas leaves, Dr. Wilhelm instructs Friedrich that she should sleep in her corset, and Friedrich ties her to the bed as to not, quote, tear the room to ribbons. The only man who doesn't restrain her is Dr. Eberhardt, who insists she be untied immediately and instructs Dr. Wilhelm to stop sedating her with what looks like chloroform. So what makes Dr. Eberhardt different from the other men in the movie? Well, like Ellen, he is an outcast of society, living outside the bounds of normalcy. Dr. Wilhelm was Dr. Eberhardt's student, and he tells Friedrich that Dr. Eberhardt's divisive approach to teaching led him to be kicked out of his home country. So Ellen and Dr. Eberhardt have this kinship throughout the film. In a moving scene where Ellen confesses to Thomas that she has brought the plague to Visburg by calling on Nosferatu in her youth, she rips off her dress and corset in hysterics. She's trying to get rid of her shame, but it isn't completely gone. The only way to completely rid herself of the shame is to engage in the thing that she is most shameful and most fearful of, kissing Nosferatu. Most of this film is shot in blue and gray light, which gives a melancholy feel to the shots. The only point in which we see warm tones is at the end of the film, when Ellen and Nosferatu consummate their relationship per se. Of course, this warmth brings about sunlight, which kills them both, as they have now physically become one again. There was a lot of discourse last year about actors with Instagram face being cast in period pieces and how it's distracting to watch. I sort of agree. And for those who aren't chronically online, Instagram face is a slang term used to describe someone's appearance as being heavily filtered, usually by way of overdone Botox and fillers. But Lily has this sort of timeless beauty with almond eyes and sharp cheekbones, regardless of what cosmetic work she has done. She has this face where she kind of just looks over it all the time, and I love that for her. And if you're really chronically online, you'll know what this means. Trench coat buttoned to the top. Anyways, I think this is the start of a massive career in acting for her, and I'm excited to see what this year brings. Ellen Hutter is a complicated female character whose shame about her desires manifests into a blood-sucking vampire. For being a monster movie, Nosferatu is really a heartfelt movie about desires and lust and ridding ourselves of shame. Now, I'm not saying sleep with a vampire to rid yourself of shame, though that's your prerogative. If anything, I would give this film a watch just to see the 2,000 real rats they used on set. Yes. Thank you for tuning in to Silver Screen Queens. New episodes out every other Tuesday on Spotify with video episodes here on YouTube. Thanks again, and that's all, folks.